everybody. Welcome back to our final lesson for Chapter 15, American Art and Literature. This whole chapter has been about reform movements and changes in American society in the early to mid 1800s, about 1820-ish to around 1860. And with that social and political change came changes and influences in the arts. So today we'll be looking at how those changes in society helped to influence the development of American art. And as you can see, I've already done audio recordings, so you could use those if you choose. Otherwise, let us move on to our key terms. And our key terms for today are the Hudson River School, transcendentalist, and with that, transcendentalism, individualism, and civil disobedience. And like most of our lessons, I would like to start with a question. What makes a civilization? Is it buildings? Is it industry? Is it agriculture? What differentiates the civilized from the uncivilized? And with that, what defines culture? So for those of you that had World Studies last year, I know you talked about culture involving the thoughts and actions of people groups. Now, today, if you were to travel around the world, you could see a little or a lot of American influence almost no matter where you went. Music, fast food, Coca-Cola have penetrated just about every culture in the world. But back in the early 1800s, the United States really had very little cultural influence around the world or even around America. Up to this point, American writers and artists held to European styles of expression, but by the mid-1800s, American artists and writers began developing their own style and developing something that was uniquely American. And speaking of the influence of American culture, I want you to look closely at this picture. Do you see anything in it that shows possibly where this picture was taken? Well, as we look around the picture, if you zoom in on the cup, you can see that it is written in both English and Japanese. That's right, I took this picture after having gone to and picked up a cheeseburger at McDonald's in Tokyo. So let's start with artists. Now, the first group that really pushed for an American art or an American style in art was a group known as the Hudson River School. It was a group of painters that painted vivid landscapes of New York's Hudson River region. Artists from this school, or those that reflected that style, are Asher B. Durand, Thomas Cole, who we're looking at right now, and African-American artist Robert S. Duncanson. And other artists of this time kind of picked up on this idea of looking around at what was going on in the country and started painting scenes of either of the hardworking country people or the glorified frontier life and the lives of Native Americans. And we're going to discuss this in further detail towards the end of our discussion today, but I just want us to know that the first group that pushed for an American style in art was the Hudson River School, and they focused on landscapes of upstate New York and the Hudson River region, and that other artists picked up on this and started painting scenes that reflected frontier life or the hardworking people in the American countryside. So with the visual arts, you have that coming with the Hudson River School, but American writers at this time also started developing their own style, and one of the earliest and most famous of American writers was a poet named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and he based many of his poems on the past, or more specifically on Indian life. And other poets at this time picked up on this, like John Greenleaf Whittier, Francis Watkins Harper, and they chose to use their poetry to speak out on social issues, specifically with these two authors speaking out on slavery. And some poets really only published a few works, but their impact has been reached up until this very day. For instance, one of the most famous of American poets, Walt Whitman, he only published one book of his poems, but in that book he celebrated democracy and wrote very proudly about being a nation of many nations. Likewise, famous poet Emily Dickinson wrote about 1,700 poems, but in her lifetime, only about 7 of them were actually published. But to this day, she is recognized as one of our nation's greatest poets, and our next video is going to kind of give the historical context of Emily Dickinson and other American poets and the cultural importance of these early American poets.
In December 1830, Emily Dickinson was born in this house in the little inland town of Amherst in Massachusetts, New England. In the early part of the 19th century, poets were quite an accepted part of the literary scene in the US. There was Longfellow, for example, in Harvard. His poetry made him famous throughout the country, the first really well-known US poet. Then there was Oliver Wendell Holmes, a doctor first, but a successful poet too. Successful in that people read his poems and liked them. A little later came Walt Whitman, from a relatively poor and uncultured background. He too was to become a household name. All these poets were men, of course, and their poetry was published and their reputations made in their own time. They were an essential part of the struggle of this newborn country, the United States, to find its own identity, to build on the wonderful democratic legacy given by their founding fathers 60 or 80 years before. The founding fathers were as much interested in developing the minds and imaginations of their people as in the building of roads or systems of government. In exploring the life and work of the woman Emily Dickinson, we come immediately up against some remarkable features in her story. Firstly, to be a woman poet was in itself almost impossibly difficult. Women were expected to be cultured and to read poetry, perhaps, but to write it seriously was not expected. Education and literary talent was for men. However, there were some success stories around. From England, the works of the Bronte sisters, for example, were known and admired by Emily. The second matter is that Emily's work was hardly published in her lifetime. Only a few relatives and friends knew that she wrote. Even fewer people recognized her astonishing talent. When they were published not long after her death, her poems had an immediate success. Finally, the way she conducted her private life is equally astounding. From the age of 30, she hardly ever left her home. She rarely met anyone outside her immediate family. She did write forcefully to a few select correspondents, but that was all. For 26 years, she was almost a total recluse. You might think that the poetry of such a person would mean little to the world at large, until you read it.
So far, we have discussed the growing numbers of paintings with American themes, and we've talked about poets writing about democracy and social injustice through the mid-1800s. Now, other American writers at this time started bringing American themes into their writing instead of borrowing from European styles and ideas. And two early writers to write using American themes were Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper. Irving combined history with fantasy in his stories. Irving's famous for Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. These are two of his best-known tales, and each of these combine these elements of history with fantasy. Now, Cooper set his novels, The Deerslayer and The Last of the Mohicans, in the American past, and specifically during the time of the French and Indian War. And he kind of gave this ideal view of the relations between white settlers and Native Americans on the frontier. And these stories kind of gave a richness to the American past to the point that they started gaining readers even in Europe, not just in America. Some of the later writers of this era included Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, and William Wells Brown, and a few female writers. So Herman Melville, most famously known for Moby Dick. And it's interesting to me that Moby Dick really had very limited success when it was first published, but now it is regarded as one of the finest of all American novels. So in the list of American novels, Moby Dick is right up there, either at the top or very near the top. Nathaniel Hawthorne, in his writings, focused on the Puritan notions of sin and salvation, and in his novel The Scarlet Letter shows how a young man is consumed with guilt when he tries to hide his sins from the world. One of my favorite authors, Edgar Allan Poe, his stories tended to focus on the macabre, the morbid, gruesome, chilling, scary, etc. But he is also credited as becoming the father of the detective story because many of his stories were centered around mysteries that had to be solved by the end. So he's really credited as the father of the detective story. And a name that you may not be as familiar with, William Wells Brown, was an early African-American writer who wrote a novel named Clotel, which was a novel that directly dealt with slave life. So from these novelists, you can see that they're embracing the American past and giving an idealized view of it, but also developing a style that is uniquely American. And as far as women authors for this time, many ended up actually selling more books than men, but to this day, only a few of these novels were read. So there were some very popular female authors at this time, but their work hasn't really stood the test of time like that of Melville, Hawthorne, or Poe.
In the years just before the Civil War, writers were intensely involved in the issues of their time, and in many cases had a strong influence on their contemporaries. But three major literary figures of the time, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, avoided or withdrew from involvement in these issues. Edgar Allan Poe appealed directly to his readers' senses and emotions. Poe believed that art should be created in the cause of beauty. In The Raven, the poet, tortured by memories of his dead love, Lenore, is visited one midnight by a mysterious raven. Desperate to find out if he will meet Lenore in another world, the poet questions the raven, but the raven speaks only the single word, nevermore.
He was fascinated by the powers of the imagination to create worlds that were not in the real world. And his fiction in different ways reflects that, as well as his poetry.
Annabel Lee is written in the form of a lyrical ballad and deals with a recurring theme in Poe's work, the loss of a beautiful, loved woman.
It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me.
To this day, Poe's horror stories, such as The Cask of Amontillado, The Black Cat, and The Fall of the House of Usher, are among his most popular works. Nathaniel Hawthorne first gained public attention when Poe hailed his talent. Fascinated by the psychological effects of Puritanism on New Englanders, Hawthorne took as his themes guilt, moral responsibility, and human destiny. The Scarlet Letter is the story of Hester Prynne, a young woman who is sentenced to wear a scarlet letter A as a token of her sin of adultery.
But the point which drew all eyes and, as it were, transfigured the wearer was that scarlet letter, so fantastically embroidered and illuminated upon her bosom. It had the effect of a spell, taking her out of the ordinary relations with humanity and enclosing her in a sphere by herself.
So with Hawthorne, just as with Emerson, we can see a really direct line back to Puritan thought and ways of dealing with reality. Hawthorne was interested in the way that the imagination could delude and mislead people. And he was also doubting what we saw in reality, and often raising the question of whether what we saw was a dream or real.
Along with the change in American art and literature of this time came a change in the philosophy of many Americans. And this starts in New England. A small but very influential group of writers and thinkers started calling themselves transcendentalists. They believed that the most important truths in life transcended or went beyond human reason. They valued emotion more than reason and believed that each person should try to live up to the divine possibilities within them. The leading transcendentalist was Ralph Waldo Emerson, the most popular essayist and lecturer of his day. And he believed that the human spirit was reflected in nature and that civilization might provide material wealth, but nature exhibited the higher values that came from God. People came from miles and miles to hear Emerson lecture on self-reliance, character, and individualism, or the importance of each individual. And Emerson taught that each person had an inner light, that if this inner light was followed, it would guide each person to improving his life and to improving society as a whole. Now, Emerson's friend and neighbor, who we're looking at here, Mr. Henry David Thoreau, believed that industry and cities, he went beyond Emerson's belief that civilization can provide you material wealth, but he actually believed that industry and cities were ruining the nation. And he taught that happiness came from living simply, and that people should return to nature as much as possible. And in his most famous work, Walden, or On Walden Pond, he described how he lived for a year in a cabin on Walden Pond up in Massachusetts. And he described the lessons that he learned there about nature and about himself. He also believed that each person needed to decide what was right and what was wrong for himself. And this is a philosophy that went directly against this long-held value that morality was dictated by God. He also argued for civil disobedience, or the idea that people have the right to disobey unjust laws if their conscience demands it. But if a person willingly disobeys a law, he must be willing to suffer the consequences. For instance, Thoreau believed that slavery was wrong, so he refused to pay taxes that supported the Mexican War because he felt that the war promoted slavery. As a result, he was thrown in jail for not paying those taxes. Just because a law violates your principles does not mean that you are above facing the consequences for breaking those laws. And Thoreau knew that. If you were willing to stand up for a belief, get ready to face the consequences. And Thoreau's teachings on civil disobedience and non-violent protest would influence later social reformers such as Mohandas Gandhi in India and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. here in the United States, who you will learn about next year.
In the mid-19th century, Boston was the national center of book publishing and of academic excellence. Harvard College, no longer a religious institution, was on its way to becoming a great university. The nearby village of Concord was the seat of what is now called the American Renaissance, where such literary giants as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Nathaniel Hawthorne lived and wrote. The belief that God resides in all of nature and within each individual was one of the common threads of thought shared by many writers of the time. Their idealistic and romantic philosophy became known as Transcendentalism. The Transcendentalists' concern with the quality of a person's daily life on earth, also called humanism, marked a departure from the Puritan emphasis on heaven and hell. Ralph Waldo Emerson, sometimes called the Sage of Concord, believed that God's will could be discovered in the laws of nature.
He was always making these connections between what's happening in nature and what man's reaction to it is, his subjective interpretation of it. So Transcendentalism for both Emerson and Thoreau was a way of going beyond the material world into some spiritual or moral meaning that they could interpret out of that world. They used it in different ways, but that was the basic thing that they were both doing.
Starting with the belief that God's will could be discovered in the laws of nature, Emerson gradually came to oppose all organized religion as a barrier between God and the individual. Asserting that each human soul is divine, he said,
"Standing on the bare ground, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God."
Henry David Thoreau, a friend and devout follower of Emerson's, built a cabin at Walden Pond. There he wrote journals and wove them into a book called Walden.
I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what...
Which brings us to our assignment for today. The art that a person produces can speak a lot about that person and the time period that person lived in. Social studies as a discipline isn't always just learning about presidents and wars, but we study the past to know where we came from. And a big part of that is looking at the art and literature of a time period to try and understand the way people of that time period think. Now, for today's assignment, I want you to click into the Social Studies Skills Tutor, and when the tutor comes up, like this, under Visual Analysis, click on Analyzing Images, click on Level 1, and then Learn, and then complete the lesson on analyzing the image. And it's good practice, not just for the upcoming tests and the PSSAs, but for life in general. Now, once you have completed the Learn section, choose one thing that you learned about evaluating images that you had not known before and describe that in a paragraph. Say, in the Skills Tutor, I learned about this aspect when analyzing an image for its social and historical context. And this assignment is going to be worth 10 bonus points. So do your best, work hard like I know that you always do, and you will be rewarded with 10 bonus points. Now, if you have any questions on what I'm looking for in the paragraph or any questions about analyzing images, come find me and we can have a discussion, and I'll do my best to help you out. All right? Have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing what you've learned about analyzing images in their historical context. Have a great rest of your day.